Let's hear it for me, not tripping over my pants that are too long. Look at all your beautiful faces. I'm so glad to see you all. I want to thank the conference organizers who invited me here to speak today. I know that standing in front of an audience and self-deprecatingly confessing that I'm not the right person to speak can feel disingenuous, especially from someone who's speaking from the privilege of being an invited speaker. But there's still a big part of me that feels this way. But while I'm here, I'm going to have a chat about barriers, about failure, and how about being a problem child, in scare quotes, could quite possibly be the best thing that ever happened to me professionally. And I'll also talk about how, in the face of all of the barriers that I have encountered over the course of my career, I managed to find inspiration in some of the most unlikely spaces. Before I go any further, I'm required to make the following statement. I am not speaking on behalf of my employer. I am not representing my employer in any way, and for as long as I have this platform, there is no association between me and the organization that signs my paychecks. I am unfettered by anything but my desire to keep a regular job, all the while understanding that this compromise places me in a difficult position. I've worked hard to make sure that this talk doesn't end the conference on a downcast note. But in the interest of transparency and honesty, I want to say up front that there will be aspects of this talk that may be a huge bummer, particularly for those of you who identify as white and are committed to all that this belief and the associated privileges that come along with it. My friend Robin, who's here today with me, who made this very long trip with me, taught me about an experience that happens in her church when people are presented with new information that they hadn't previously considered. She told me that people can feel convicted by this new information. They can feel challenged, put on trial, and found guilty. That's really not my purpose today. I hope that in presenting ideas that may be new to you, that may be new information for you, that you will use it in pursuit of building a better, more just system. My slides are not switching. There we go. Sorry. I hope that in presenting these ideas that may be new for information for you, that you will use them in pursuit of building a better, more just system. I believe that discomfort is necessary for structural change to occur. And if you are interested in becoming a person who is more committed to justice, anti-racism, eradicating homophobia, transphobia, and discrimination of all kinds. I also want to say, in an attempt to prevent this talk from being derailed, that I won't entertain questions or comments at the end that ask me to absolve you of all blame or that require me to assure you that you're a good person. It's been my experience that when discussions of race, gender, or any issue that relates to identity take place in mixed company, it can create a conflict for people with marginalized identities. We can either choose to speak up at significant personal and social risk, or we can choose to remain silent to prevent conflict. The issue isn't your relative goodness or the degree to which you're blameless for the inequalities that exist in the profession. Even if you are an entry-level librarian, you possess certain privileges that minoritized people like myself don't have access to. My goal today is to inspire you to be less concerned about niceness and more concerned about how you can use whatever power and privilege you possess to make your individual workplaces and the profession as a whole a more equitable spaces for the most vulnerable among us. If you find yourself in need of support after the talk, I hope that you will work with those feelings with your friends, your colleagues, your families, mental health professionals, members of clergy, or whomever you might talk to about these thorny issues. But only through rigorous inquiry and commitment can we hope to lose the social inhibitions that make it difficult for nice people to wrestle with the inequality and injustices that exist in librarianship. Before I really get started, you're probably wondering, I thought you already had started. I want to share a little bit of my origin story. I've been an active library user since I was 3 years old. and libraries have been a part of my life for all of my life. But when I was 5, a librarian quite literally saved my life. And it's hard to overlook the kind of impact that that had. On a stormy morning in 1974, my mother bustled my older brother and me off to school just like she did every other morning. The skies were leaden, the air was muggy and warm, and there was a sense of foreboding hanging in the air. Shortly after my mom dropped us off, all the power went out, and kids started to cry. I didn't really know what tornadoes were. I just knew that they were scary and bad, and I was terrified. And I also knew that my big brother was in a classroom 3 floors above mine. So I did what any logical 5-year-old would do. I sneaked out of my classroom and made a beeline for the stairs, just as the winds began to howl. And at that moment, the school librarian, Miss Jean Blackman, spotted me, flew from her office in the library, caught me by the back of my shirt, and dragged me to safety. In the aftermath, it was clear that we had been spared, but she couldn't have known that at the time, that the school would be safe and that I would be safe. But as I got older, I thought about this story a lot. And I also thought about how after teachers would treat me like a curiosity and parade me around to other classrooms so that I could show off my reading abilities that were on par with students who were 3 or 4 years older than I was. Ms. Blackman made sure that I was rewarded for these demonstrations by granting me extra time in the library stacks. She held space for me even after I transferred to a different school in a wealthy and mostly segregated part of town. She let me look through book catalogs and choose books that I wanted to read when it was time to prepare orders, and she never had anything other than an encouraging word for me. Ms. Blackman made my school library a happy place, some place where I felt like I belonged, and a place that was made better by my presence. Because of her gentle and firm stewardship, I learned to love the library as a place. My vision of what libraries could be was shaped by Black women. It's important for me to say this because the racial demographics of the profession in North America indicate that my experiences were not at all common. All of the librarians I encountered growing up were Black women, which is startling when you consider that in the United States, Black people make up only about 5% of the professional library population. Between the ages of 5 to 18, everywhere I looked, I saw the faces of librarians and other library workers who looked like me, who came from similar circumstances. And I think that this representation went a long way toward making me a more confident child, who even at a very young age knew the value of her work. Black librarians took care of me. If I couldn't pay my library fines by letting me sit quietly at a table and read to my heart's content, I might not have been able to check the books out, but I could still read them. And there were many times that the Black library workers would hold these items behind the desk for me as long as nobody was waiting for them, when I couldn't check them out because I had overdue fines. Black librarians showed me kindness, and they showed me that I mattered, regardless of my financial status, my race, my gender, or any other identity markers I carried with me. When I look back on it, it feels truly miraculous, in large part because it was an experience that I would never have again. I moved to Canada in 2001, and at the time I thought a degree in African American Studies, which I had earned as a master's degree, wouldn't carry me very far in a city like Vancouver, where Black people were less than 1% of the population. I needed to find a line of work that would, 1, make me employable and earn me a degree from a Canadian university. And that last point is important because, as I learned from a fellow immigrant, having a diploma from a Canadian school made it a lot harder for companies to say that you didn't have the right qualifications. I didn't work in libraries immediately out of school. In fact, I thought I really only wanted to work in corporations. But after a few years of designing systems that sold things to people that they didn't really need, and frustrating experiences of designing systems that we had to make them more complex so that we could sell technical support contracts, I decided to give public libraries a try. I knew that I wanted to go into management someday and maybe even become a library director. I had the drive, the confidence, and the ambition that I thought would carry me far in librarianship. And because I thought that of libraries as feminist, activist workspaces that helped democratize education and provided access for so many who had so little. And while that's not untrue necessarily, I now see that I was displaying some of the earliest signs of vocational awe, a term coined by my friend Fobazi Itar, that's used to describe a set of ideas, values, and assumptions librarians have about themselves and about the profession that result in notions that libraries are inherently good. But instead of finding a feminist utopia where everybody got along and that there was hummus at every potluck, what I found instead kind of startled me. I had unknowingly entered a deeply conservative profession that was committed to upholding the status quo, and one that talked a really good line about increasing equity, diversity, and inclusion, but took very few concrete steps in that direction, preferring to throw their hands up in the air and call it a pipeline problem or something else that was beyond their control. I looked around at professional conferences and primarily saw people who looked nothing like me, or none who had had the same life experiences that I'd had. On the rare chances that I did encounter other Black female librarians, almost every one of them shared stories of how the profession's racial demographics and dominant culture caused them to question whether they had a future in librarianship or whether they even belonged in the profession at all. What I discovered through these conversations is that my experiences weren't isolated. Many others had similar complaints. One librarian I spoke with told me about a time when a colleague called her credibility into question in front of a class that she was delivering on information literacy. She was interrupted by the course instructor who asked her, in front of the other students, mind you, "Why are you a professor? What do you teach?" And when she told them there that she was there to teach the students about information literacy, the professor sighed loudly and said, again, in front of a classroom full of students, "You get to be a professor doing this?" effectively undermining her authority in the classroom. Another librarian I spoke with, Nancy Kirkpatrick, shared examples of microaggressions that she had encountered in the workplace with her white colleagues, who urged her to present evidence of these instances to management. When she did, she was later told by management that these racial microaggressions didn't exist, and that what she had described was merely implicit bias, and nothing would be done to address the issues that she brought forth. Nancy told me that this experience left her feeling defeated and angry, but now she's feeling more resigned about the outcome. Everyone has their own narrative, she told me, and what I've learned is that as a woman of color, mine has less value. These stories had unifying threads that were woven through my own experiences. Each person felt undermined by white colleagues, had their professional expertise discredited, sometimes loudly, and what was also noticeable is that each experience had lowered the librarian's morale, making them feel as though they weren't valued as much as their white counterparts, or that their accomplishments and qualifications were not acknowledged by their colleagues. Katrina Davis Kendrick, the associate professor and associate librarian at Medford Library at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. You know what they do when they give you a really long title, but they can't pay you a lot? That's what that is. She's been studying the effect of low morale among academic librarians. In a 2017 study that she conducted, she defined low morale as repeated and protracted exposure to emotional, verbal, written, or system abuse and neglect in the workplace. Katrina also found that there were two unique impact factors for racial and ethnic minority academic librarians: stereotype threat and deauthentication. And stereotype threat is a sense that a racialized person might feel that they're going to be judged by a negative stereotype that exists. And deauthentication basically means that the affected person reduces aspects of their personality, personal responses, languages, or any other sort of personality characteristics in order to avoid those microaggressions, in order to avoid incivility, punishment, or retaliation. And what I'd learned through these conversations and papers that I'd read was that I wasn't alone in feeling the impact of feeling racially and culturally isolated in the workplace. I started to think deeper about this subject, and I reflected upon other areas where I felt I had to alter my career ambitions and diminish my capabilities. Many of the other minoritized librarians I spoke with had experienced many of the same issues, so much so that many of them were either had or were making plans to leave the profession because the stress was too great. And while I know that the lack of cultural literacy in many workplaces greatly impacted my work experiences and those of other minoritized library workers I'd spoken to, it wasn't the only barrier that I and others had faced. Physical limitations also affected my ability to see myself as a professional success. When I entered the workforce in 2004, I didn't really think about accessibility, and I'm embarrassed by that now. I didn't think about the ways that libraries, both as buildings and as ideas, can be inhospitable to people with physical limitations. I was fit, I'd done a whole bunch of fitness boot camps, but then I started to notice that I was moving a little more slowly, and I couldn't complete the punishing workouts that I had previously been able to do just a couple of years earlier. 4 years into my career, I was diagnosed with 2 chronic illnesses, both of which can cause extreme fatigue and pain, and all of the overexercising I'd done to become more fit resulted in the rapid degeneration of the cartilage in both of my knees. As I said before, I'm really ashamed to admit that I didn't really give a lot of thought about how people with disabilities can be limited by their work environments until I was affected by it. I had a deficiency in my understanding, and I'm embarrassed that it took this personal experience to make me aware of the ways that physical ability is held up as a measure of success or fitness for the profession. I'd learned from talking with other people with disabilities that remote work can often make it possible for many to bridge the gap between physical presence and being able to do the jobs that they had been hired to do. Previously, I'd worked in large corporations with offices spread all over the world, and my model for what management might look like, or what that accommodation might look like, involved having the flexibility to work remotely when needed. What was fundamental to this model was always being available by a telepresence, whether that was chat, or at the most basic level, just even being reachable by email. But the typical method of providing library services is so heavily dependent on presence. And the thinking is, if you aren't physically located in the office, it's quite difficult to succeed at your job. I ran into this wall head on. I was told that my absences were creating hardships for my direct reports, even though my performance reviews suggested otherwise. As libraries continue to pursue the newest technologies and services that appeal to a wide variety of library patrons, such as tool lending, makerspaces, digital creation laboratories, library jobs, and particularly those in public libraries, seem to follow along a very traditional line that's tied to desk coverage or in-person information service or program delivery. But it isn't the only nature of library work that makes it difficult to be a person with a disability in the workplace. Librarian Kel Karpinski recently tweeted about a conversation they had with a friend about the difficulty of disclosing your chronic illness in the workplace. When their colleagues weren't suggesting treatment X or treatment Y for their conditions, they were also failing to provide the space for chronically ill library workers to talk about their health concerns openly and honestly. Around the time that my own personal health started to falter, I had to face that my professional ambitions would need to change, and that was really difficult for me to accept. I'd done a lot of work on myself to appear confident and competent, particularly in the face of opposition, so to see everything that I thought I wanted start to slip away from me served a particularly nasty blow. We say, and we talk a good line about wanting to be able to provide library services to all people, no matter where they encounter us. But we make it difficult for librarians or community librarians to work where our community partners are by locking our supporting documents behind VPNs, virtual private networks, or closed systems that only work when you are physically connected in a workstation in a library building. And while I realize that privacy and security regulations vary from place to place, and as stewards of community resources, libraries bear a responsibility to safeguard our systems, I believe that the use of telepresence is key to envisioning more open and accessible workplaces, and it goes a long way toward positioning the library as a more inclusive space. I thought that not being able to be a library director meant that I was a failure. And as a failure, I had no hope of seeing my circumstances change. I started to think about positions that had greater responsibility, but that would be less demanding than the corner office. And I talked about future plans with trusted friends. Yet when it came to applying for these positions, a few people advised me not to seek them out because, quote, they'd never hire somebody with an accommodation for a job that has more responsibility. I felt defeated. I felt hopeless. And it negatively impacted my willingness to apply for new jobs that were posted internally. Yet my physical health wasn't my only area of concern. My emotional health also suffered as a result of encountering these barriers. When I spoke clearly and confidently in meetings about areas of my expertise, I was called strident, aggressive, or positional. Positional is a really interesting word because it suggests that only the person who is advocating for change is taking a position. I want to say today very clearly that failing to advocate for equity and justice is also a position. Not creating supportive and protective environments for minoritized colleagues is also a position. Nothing about libraries is neutral. The reason that these actions are not considered positional or political speaks to the ways that benevolent whiteness and the flattening of lived experience works in library and information science. When we assert that libraries are these egalitarian institutions where everyone is welcome, even in the face of evidence to the contrary, it inevitably positions those of us who think otherwise as adversaries. And when you're viewed as an adversary, it becomes yet another barrier on the long list of hostilities that minoritized librarians faced. I wanted to learn to do better. So I dutifully attended communication workshops and tried to put the techniques I learned into practice, yet I still fell short. I hired a career coach at my own expense because I wanted to develop skills that would help me be better and help me better cope with letting go of my ambitions. Imagine my surprise when, at the end of our engagement, the coach told me that she couldn't, in good faith, help me cope with the situation I was in because she felt it was harmful. She believed that teaching me how to be more like the system that was causing me hardship went against her professional ethics and was doing me a grave disservice. Her advice to me was to start developing an exit plan as soon as possible and to start thinking about what the next phase of my life would be. On the surface, that sounds like rational advice. I could find work in a library system that would be more closely aligned with my sense of integrity and one that demonstrated through words and actions their commitment to advocating for equity and inclusion in their workplaces. I don't doubt that such workplaces exist, but the reality of the demographics and the words of other minoritized librarians that I've spoken with were a caution for me, regardless of the location, the leadership, or the well-written mission statements. The fact was that I would more than likely still be the only in these organizations. This was the world I operated in, and it was my responsibility to try to hold on to those qualities and values that reminded me of who I was, where I'd come from, and where I hoped the profession would go in the future. I thought about the conversations I'd had and the articles that I'd read and discovered that it wasn't unheard of for minoritized library workers to exit the profession when the stress of existing, merely existing, became too great. The daily burden of being a Black woman in a predominantly white workplace negatively impacted my mental and emotional health as well as my performance. But because I was the only full-time Black librarian on staff in my organization, I didn't have colleagues I could turn to in support. I couldn't even really bring it up in the workplace out of fear of being told that I was imagining things or that these conversations would be making people uncomfortable. I felt silenced and isolated. I felt like a nuisance to be barely tolerated. And because of those feelings of isolation, I began to guard myself with an emotional shield to protect myself against microaggressions and microinvalidations. In a 2005 article titled "Tripping Over the Color Line," Todd Honma asked why it seemed that library and information studies scholars and students don't want to talk openly about race. And I think that there are aspects of his findings that are applicable to other identities as well. The overarching monoculture that informs librarianship ensures that people of color, people with disabilities, or people who are LGBTQ+ will struggle. Our struggles will largely be invisible to those in the majority. If we raise these issues as a concern, they are either ignored or we're made to believe that we are the problem, not the unequal and oppressive systems that all libraries operate under. But another thing that keeps these issues from being discussed is the idea that libraries are nice spaces where complaint or dissent is discouraged, and in some cases, even actively silenced. As a profession, we hold the myth of our own benevolence close to our hearts. We are nice people who strive to do the right thing so that when someone comes along to suggest that our inherent rightness causes them pain, we either don't want to or can't see the ways that we contribute to and advance these systems of inequality. Hanma's mythic benevolence of whiteness and Fobazi Itar's vocational awe prevent people from engaging with any idea that challenges the status quo. We're burdened by the idea that libraries are inherently good and just spaces where everyone will be treated equally. And we are causing harm to minoritized library workers by failing to give credence to their lived experiences. When your organization cannot or refuses to see you for who you really are, it's no wonder that this fatigue causes minoritized library workers to consider leaving the profession. Let's skip ahead here. The U.S. Center for Community Practice calls these feelings minority stress, a term that first came to prominence in queer communities in 2003. Minority stress refers to the additional stress that members of marginalized groups experience because of the prejudice and discrimination that they face. I'd append this definition to include that being the only one in your workplace, even when people are not intentionally hurtful, contributes to minority stress. And I would also argue that the experience of minority stress is additive to general stress, and it can lead to poorer health outcomes compared to those who do not experience it. So, what was it that made me think that I wouldn't be able to find sympathy in my own workplace? Well, Canadians don't like to talk about race, unless it's to say to a racialized person, this is Canada, and we don't have a problem with racism. And it's especially a Canadian feeling because we're so close to the United States. Until very recently, it wasn't really even possible to get a census count of how many people in Canada identified as Black with respect to cultural membership, because the Canadian census only counts country of origin, not ethnic background. So I can declare that I'm American because that's where I was born, but there's really no way for me to declare an ethnic identity. So while being statistically invisible, but I was also hyper-visible in other ways. For example, I would walk through the library just on my daily constitutionals, and I would notice that whenever I encountered Black library patrons, they would gravitate to me. You'd see a smile bloom on their face. You'd see the stress just leave their bodies for a second because they didn't have to deal with the specter of racism tinging their interaction. So representation matters, even in ways that you might not expect, particularly when providing library services to people of color. Despite what you may have heard about race being a social construct and has no basis in fact, let me say this. While it is true that race is a social construct that was created to divide people and ensure that people who were classified as white would gain and retain advantages that were not made available to anyone who was not white, race also carries cultural significance that members of the in-group use to form bonds and to emphasize kinship linkages that people use to form relationships, organize communities, and to share in a wealth of cultural capital. Race is at once fictional and very, very real. Racial and cultural representation matters to minoritized people in the workplace as well, and when you lack the social capital necessary to create those bonds with your colleagues, that situation will begin to wear very heavily on your sense of well-being. In her book, The Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table, Minda Hart writes about moral injury, a term that originated with the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. Moral injury is defined as psychological trauma, a construct that describes extreme and unprecedented life experiences, including the harmful aftermath of exposure to such events. The kinds of events that are the most harmful are those that go against a person's deeply held moral beliefs or expectations. My expectation upon entering this profession was that I would be surrounded by fiercely intelligent women who were concerned about equity and social justice. My childhood experiences led me to believe that I would encounter many, many Black women, but what reality taught me was that it was foolish of me to hold those expectations. The harsh, isolating, and hostile work environments that I and other minoritized people have endured have created trauma in many of us, and I don't say that term lightly. This trauma leads to feelings of shame, guilt, anxiety, and anger, feelings that become sanitized and labeled imposter syndrome, which not only minimizes the seriousness of the trauma, but it shifts the burden of healing this trauma onto those who are already traumatized. People who experience these feelings like I have feel that we aren't good enough to be in the positions we hold, not because we lack confidence in our feelings, but because the oppressive systems, the lack of cultural literacy on behalf of our organizations and colleagues, and the lack of representation makes it difficult for us to trust what we know and our own competencies. But in order for us to counter these feelings, we have to challenge their validity and champion our own successes even when our respective organizations may not, and begin to collect meaningful experiences and valued relationships with like-minded colleagues who can act as the mirrors that we hold up to ourselves that enable us to see ourselves for who we really are. Now, I'm not standing up here claiming I've had it harder than any of you. I know many of you in the audience are also struggling with barriers and impediments to your career, roadblocks that I may never understand because I'm not you. And I also suspect a fair number of you also received and internalized the advice that you should remain silent about any inequalities or injustices that you have experienced as you try to advance your careers. Reprisal can be swift and dirty in the professional world, and finding library jobs seems to get harder and harder with every passing year. But if I could urge you to do anything as a result of this keynote, it would be to try to break this silence. Talk openly and often about the kinds of interpersonal struggles you are experiencing, especially if those struggles are a result of cultural fit, your perceived otherness, or any other qualifications that set you outside of the norm. Speak up when you witness bias against your minoritized colleagues, and listen to us as we share these stories without explaining or justifying the treatment we've experienced. Make noise. Be heard. Your safety, your mental health, your confidence in your abilities are worth the effort and worth the risk. Not only will you lift your own burden by daring to speak out and speak truth to power, but the conversation you begin will also benefit others who have, I assure you, been exactly where you are and feel exactly the way that you do. I learned that by being silent, I ceded power to oppressive systems that were designed to keep me in line. And in ceding that power, I contributed to that system that made it difficult for anyone like me to succeed. I was afraid to use the one privilege I had, my voice, to speak up about injustice because stress and exhaustion had taken their toll. And I was weary of traveling this road alone. I recently came across a video clip of the filmmaker Ava DuVernay, where she talked about finding her true purpose even though the road ahead of her wasn't clear. DuVernay is one of very few Black female film directors working in Hollywood, and she was the first Black female film director to be nominated for an Oscar. In the clip that I saw, I call her Ava because, she follows me on Twitter. In the clip that I saw, Ava said, "When you're in your lane, there is no traffic." What she meant by that is once she truly knew what she was put on this earth to do, what kinds of stories she wanted to tell, and once she had a clear vision of the kinds of workplaces she wanted to create as a director, Ava said that her path ahead became clear. I'm quoting here, "I'm less interested in banging down the door of some man who doesn't want me there," she wrote. But she still maintains that there are ways that we can learn to work within these systems so that we can push for not only the inclusion of different views and perspectives, but the centering of marginalized voices and experiences. I differ from that slightly. I think the systems that currently exist need to be completely destroyed and rebuilt. I think the systems that we currently operate in are diseased, they're toxic, and not only do they not benefit the people who are most oppressed by them, they also don't benefit the people who are doing the oppressing or the people who have the most privileges. I knew that I could never be as polished or professional or as white as the people who are at the top of my organizations. I'd never enjoy the same privileges that come along with being part of the dominant culture. And I've carried a lot of shame for a lot of years for things that were beyond my control. But even as I face these challenges in one area of my life, other areas continue to open up for me. Like, for example, I continue to receive requests to talk at library and user experience conferences like this one, and my social and political capital among justice-minded library and information professionals continues to rise. I'm heartened by that. It's helped me to see that there are other ways to find fulfillment, to create meaning, to pave my own lane, to use Ava DuVernay's phrase, and it was the development of this lane that I'm in right now that led me here to speak to you today. I'm burned out on librarianship, to be perfectly honest, as it's currently practiced. I'm really tired of the language of social justice being co-opted to talk about issues that impact minoritized people the most without library leaders giving up space, giving up power, or giving up influence to make these changes happen. I may lack the organizational power and influence to affect any significant changes in my own workplace, but despite the drawbacks, the fears of reprisal, and uncertainty over my own future, I felt I had to speak out. Because to remain silent would be doing a disservice to the Black library workers, to the people of color who work in libraries, to trans people or disabled people, or anyone else who feels that they were drummed out of the profession because they were too much, too confident, too queer, too Black, too indigenous, or any other identity that does not fit the dominant mold. I knew that if I simply closed the door on the idea of making change or influencing others to make change, that I would be just as complicit as the gatekeepers who upheld and reinforced the systems of inequality that were causing Black, indigenous, and other library workers of color so much moral injury. I believe that the future of this profession isn't just dependent on publishers negotiating fair ebook licensing deals or staying ahead of the rapidly changing technological requirements that our patrons expect of us. Our future is also dependent on how libraries include its most vulnerable workers and how we prepare them for success. When I think of what the library of the future might look like, I not only imagine a space where patrons have open and unfettered access to the resources they need to enrich their lives, but I also dream of a world where minoritized library workers are fully supported, are well represented in library leadership roles, and never have to bear the burden of cultural isolation or questions about their cultural fit. I dream of a profession where the troublemakers continue to make good trouble, and where this good trouble causes those in the majority to acknowledge these injustices and leads them to become advocates for dismantling these systems and creating something new that benefits all of us. This good trouble will mean inconvenience, difficulty, and yes, chaos. But in the long run, it reminds us that while we may be different, our difference makes it so that we can't continue to coast on a sense of fairness that only benefits the majority. We are united within this system, and it's everyone's responsibility to make it a place where we can all be successful, regardless of how that success is defined. My vision for the kind of profession I'd like to see came from an unusual place. While I draw strength from the many minoritized library workers who have come before me, and I draw inspiration from those who will follow me long after I leave this profession, I wasn't really fully able to articulate my ideas about the kinds of people who would be necessary to make it more equitable. And then in September 2019, a new guiding star emerged. Now, this is Melbourne, and I don't feel like I have to do an explanation about the Untitled Goose Game, but I know that this is being recorded, so I will do an explanation of the Untitled Goose Game. But if you're somebody who is like me, who is extremely online, you have probably heard of the Untitled Goose Game. And it was developed by House, which is a Melbourne-based game studio. And it was developed in conjunction with Panic Software. And in the game, players play the game as a little white goose. The goose has a to-do list that they have to get through in order to complete a level. Sorry to make you watch a little bit of a commercial. In order to complete these tasks, why isn't it showing? Oh no, it's not showing. Well, okay. In order to complete these tasks, the goose must interact with the unassuming yet dominant humans who live in the village. Now, the goose isn't violent, but they do create disturbances by taking items that they need to complete their list. The goose does this by loudly honking and flapping their wings to create diversions. They're not afraid to take up space and to honk or speak loudly in order to meet their needs. The goose doesn't really change itself in order to make itself more easily understood by humans. They just firmly remain a goose. And they retain those qualities that make them who they are. I find it really interesting that the developers of the game took the time to say that when you are talking about the goose, to refer to it as they, because people kept saying that the goose was a male. It's like, no, the goose is non-binary, and the goose goes by they. The goose doesn't offer fake smiles. It doesn't speak or honk deferentially in order so as not to appear threatening to people. They're simply just a chaos agent who exists to make the townspeople face the fact that they don't have as much control over their lives as they might think. In its inimitable fashion, the goose taught me that my mission as a member of this field was to be the person who reminded us that while we have made great strides, and we still have a long way to go toward uplifting and including underrepresented people in library and information science. Just like the goose, I have a to-do list that I have to complete before I can level up. My to-do list includes advocating for justice, equity, and inclusion for library workers, to challenge the status quo, and to provide support to minoritized library workers wherever they may be. Because, like the goose, I am isolated. There are no other geese in the game. I have to take inspiration and make meaning where I can find it. And I do that by connecting with other Black women, other minoritized people, and our allies, as a way of reminding me that I deserve to exist as I am, and that while I am a bit of a problem child, that doesn't mean that I'm a detriment to my workplace or that I don't have a place in this profession. I'm just gonna let this play for a second, because what I love about this is the Goose has encountered a structure that should keep it from going after its goal. The goal is the little bell that's at the top. You can see up there. The Goose just wrecks shit, pardon my French, because he has a goal in mind, and he doesn't let anyone get in its way. The Goose is stuck in like a little miniature toy town right now. So there are obstacles, there are roadblocks, but the Goose keeps on keeping on. And it's really a strange feeling to be playing this game at 2 o'clock in the morning because I have insomnia and I can't sleep. To realize that I'm getting emotional playing a game about a stupid goose. And so as you can see, the Goose is trying to find its way out. This is quite long, so I probably won't play the whole thing. I'm trying to be mindful of time. But even as the Goose finds obstacles, it continues to think, and it continues to orient itself. You can see that the game will reorient itself from the perspective of the Goose, and it continues to orient itself and find the paths of least resistance so that it can get to its final goal. This Goose is an inspiration. And I want the Goose to be your guide for when you are faced with opposition, with a lack of cultural understanding, or if you're the only minoritized person in your workplace. The irate townspeople may not want the Goose to complete its tasks, and maybe rightfully so, because the Goose is taking things that don't belong to them. But the Goose remains undeterred. It's important to the Goose that they continue with their errands, just as it's important to you that you hold true to your purpose. People in positions of power will try to redirect your energies, sometimes in forceful and demeaning ways. But I believe that for every blissfully innocent library employee who either can't or won't see how they contribute to inhospitable environments for their minoritized colleagues, there must be a Goose who will take up the cause of making them reckon with their biases. Playing this game provided catharsis when I most needed it. The game helped me realize that trying to mold myself into a form that, while more palatable to the majority, was unrecognizable to me wasn't the path forward to finding my own fulfillment. The Goose showed me that sometimes being a nuisance can be a path toward my own redemption, toward finding the confidence in myself that my circumstances had drummed out of me for so long. I can flap my wings and honk loudly when I encounter injustices, and I can continue to do so until people in power make firm commitments to effect change. And so can you. It's my hope that after this keynote, that you'll find it within yourselves to become the horrible geese in your own organizations. Call me an optimist, but I have faith that if enough of us honk loud enough and create enough trouble, that we can't help but make libraries and information organizations safer, more equitable spaces that are committed to the success of their Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans, or disabled employees. How about a honk in solidarity? Yeah. Thank you.
I'm just in awe. I'm Cecily, thank you so very much. I think we'll take a quick drink break for Cecily. And what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to the live Q&A. I haven't readily been following. I know that there are some questions tucked in there. So once they come up, then I will be able to start reading some of those questions. I am aware that Twitter has been very busy during this keynote. So thank you to everyone who has been live tweeting and engaging with people who are in the room, as well as those who are following along from afar. So thank you. Right, so we have 3 questions. We are going to start with the one at the top. Cecily, what do you think is the best way to find other geese? I'm not going to honk, but yeah, you get the gist.
You've got to honk.
Yeah.
Twitter, honestly, social media. I know that reprisal is a very, very real concern. So if you feel comfortable in making connections from behind the relative anonymity of a locked account, I would do that. My account was locked for a very, very long time. I unlocked it for the conference today, and I will probably lock it again after the conference is over. But reaching out to people on social media, reading library journals, especially peer-reviewed library journals like In the Library with the Lead Pipe, and just staying aware of organizations like We Here, which is an organization for minoritized library workers of color, and connecting with these people, reaching out, sharing information, asking questions. Your geese will find you. They found me.
Thank you. So the next question we have is, so the first statement is, obviously we need more people from minority groups in the system to change the system. How can we do that when we don't see what we're doing to keep them at arm's length? That's a big question.
It is a big question, yeah. and I don't know that it's a question that I can answer in its totality. And I'm going to get in trouble when I say this. One of the things that I have frequently said is that I would really like to see the elimination of the LIS degree, or the Master of Library Sciences degree, as a prerequisite for somebody to be called a librarian. And the reason why I say that is in North America, the people who have the LIS usually have the benefit of money, of privilege, of education to be able to get that far. Whereas the people of color who worked as library assistants, library technicians, they generally don't have that ability or that privilege. If we opened up positions of leadership, or even if we didn't eliminate the MLS as a requirement for somebody to call themselves a professional librarian, if we opened up leadership positions so that people who are the average library workers, the ones who don't hold a degree but still have worked at the library and have demonstrated through years of service that they are capable of doing the same kind of work that somebody who had the benefit of getting a master's degree could do, I think we would actually see a lot of things begin to change. But that requires that people like us who do have the master's degree be willing to let go and cede some of that power, and a lot of us aren't willing to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to finish with the final question that's on screen, which is, how do we best support the geese and help to elevate their voices? Again, another really big question.
One way of doing it is something that somebody did for me a few years ago. There's a librarian named Chris Berg, who is the Dean of Libraries at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And Chris asked me to be her co-keynote presenter. And she didn't know me from a hole in the ground. I was just somebody who had written a few things on blogs or what have you, but she has made it a point of her career to use her platform to lift other people up. And so if you find yourselves in the position of either advancing somebody who has really good things to say that maybe people don't know a whole lot about, that's a really good way of giving somebody a leg up, so to speak. Another way that you can help people elevate their voices is when you see people being pushed aside or discredited in meetings, what have you. Don't just come up to the person after the meeting and say, that was really horrible that happened to you. Be confrontational in that moment and stand up for that person, because sometimes what will happen is the minoritized person will be thought of as being aggressive or defending themselves. But if it's someone who is white who is standing up and saying, hey, what's going on here? I think we should listen to Cecily. I think we should listen to so-and-so as they complete their thought, can go a long way toward making people realize that, what's actually happening in the room, and that this person deserves every bit as much a right to speak as anyone else.
Okay, we've had one final question pop up, so this will be the last question. Do you think that some types of libraries, for example, public libraries, are doing a better job of getting a wider mix, and why do you think that is?
No, I don't. I don't. To be perfectly honest, I think just in my own experiences, again, like that big slide, not speaking for my employer, I honestly think academic libraries are doing a lot in this area, especially in North America. I've seen people who are deans of libraries who make it very, very clear that social justice, that equity, that diversity and inclusion is very much a part of their hiring practices. They are giving people who may not necessarily have the length of service as other people, but inviting them to apply for jobs. That has happened to me a couple of times. I've had people reach out to me saying, we've got a dean of libraries or an assistant dean of libraries job open. I want you to apply. Nowhere near qualified, but just to know that somebody takes the commitment to say, everybody who's applied for this job so far has been a white guy. We need to try to reach out to people and actually ask people and invite them to apply in order to try to affect some change. So to me, it seems like academic libraries, in North America at least, are doing much of the work that I wish public libraries would catch up to.
Cecily, it has been such a thrill to have you here in Australia. I want to acknowledge also that this is your first trip down to Australia, so thank you so much for coming down to speak to us today. We have, this is for you to remember your time with us here at VALA 2020, and I'd like the audience to, again, please put your hands together for Cecily. Yeah. Thank you so much.